The existential crisis facing American democracy has many structural elements: money, gerrymandering, Supreme Court appointments. It also has many cultural and behavioral aspects. And our panel will really focus today about what has happened to how our culture has been degraded and how the values of civility and respect and the ability to listen to people who hold different views than you do has really been degraded. We have the opportunity to hear from three people today who have deeply paid attention to this issue for a long time and understand much about the roots of what caused it and what we have to do today to deal with it. I'd like to first ask Carol Anderson to make a comment about how divided are we really today?
We are very divided. And that division, to me, is speaking to the issue of the unresolved racism in American society and our inability to acknowledge it, to acknowledge its existence, and to acknowledge that we are, in fact, in a racist society and that we need to do the work to heal those divides that emanate out of slavery and out of Jim Crow and out of the removal of indigenous people and out of xenophobia in our immigration laws. Until we can really deal with that, we're having fake conversations or not real conversations about how we got here.
David Greenberg, I'd like to ask you to state your opening statement about how divided we really are.
Sure. I think the division, which Carol says, I don't think anyone would deny, is real. It's intense. It's palpable these days in a way that it hasn't felt in a very long time. I think there are a number of historical roots we might talk about today. In some ways, it goes back to the 1960s. Sometimes it feels like we are, in some senses, replaying certain debates and structures and patterns from the 60s, albeit with significant differences. But in a narrower time frame, I think we can look back at the political system to, say the 2000 Bush v. Gore, presidential election and the fight for the electoral votes in Florida, where Bush won by a few hundred votes and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Since then, we've had what political scientists and others call polarization, especially along party lines, that has left little room for the kind of brokering and compromising and working across party lines that, for much of our history was a common part of politics. And I think we're still grappling with the ways that the both parties have become increasingly ideologically homogenous, although there are also important fights going on within each party. But there's much less of an ability to talk across party lines, and that seems to extend beyond the parties into all kinds of spheres of political discourse, social media, and public life generally.
And Ellen Fitzpatrick.
Well, I can't express great optimism about where we are as a country right now, and the level of division that exists, I find to be truly alarming. I think we really, in some sense, have to go back to the Civil War and Reconstruction to understand, as Carol alluded to, what is happening today. And I think the thing that I find most concerning is the lack of agreement around the basic values and structures and institutions of democracy itself. In the Reconstruction period, we resolved a central question during the Civil War, or so we believe, that slavery as an institution would end and that certain rights would be conferred and then protected on all citizens, even though imperfectly realized. The effort to try to bring those to fruition during Reconstruction was extremely important. And then we saw in this country the rollback of those, the conferral of those rights. And what we are seeing today and hearing on a daily basis is a kind of divisive language evoking some of the most retrograde views about our fellow citizens, the right of all Americans to freely exercise a franchise, the acceptance of elections that one has not won. And I think the ways in which the two political parties have become so altered in our current moment. It is, I find, very, very deeply concerning.
There's no question that the threat to American institutions and the core values of American democracy is in front of us every single day. And yet I find in my work with the general public that there is a hunger to get past these divides, not on the far right, probably 10 to 12%, not on the far left, probably 10 to 12%, but literally the vast majority of Americans who are someplace inside those boundaries actually know where we are is really wrong and want to do something about it, but don't feel the agency to be able to do that as they watch what, David, you've talked about in Congress, and what, Carol, you've talked about systemic racism and lack of justice on so many fundamental issues. So it seems to me we have all of our institutional messages pushing us apart. At the same time, a place where I do see a ray of hope is the number, literally, of Americans who know it's wrong and want to do something about it.
I tend to agree with you, Carolyn. There is, I hesitate to use a phrase associated with Richard Nixon, but I do think there is a silent majority of people who crave greater consensus, greater civility, greater capacity to talk across political differences, to make pragmatic compromises when it comes to politics. I would say two things, though. First, this is probably true for all of us. People often pay lip service to the ideal of getting along, of compromise, and they can very easily identify in their political opponents the ways that those people fall short, but they may not always see in themselves or their own allies the ways that they too can perpetuate some of these toxic behaviors and patterns. So it is all well and good to sort of profess the ideal, and I think that actually does count for something to profess it. I mean, we'd be in a different place if people were saying they didn't want to compromise and come together. But it's often harder to kind of look in one's own house to sort of make those repairs. The other thing I would say is, I think, in the election of Joe Biden, his was certainly a message of coming together, of trying to restore some kind of common order. And we've seen this actually in a number of other elections too. I live in New York City, and I think the election of Eric Adams certainly pointed in that direction as well, our new mayor. So I do think there are some signs on the horizon that the public, when given the chance to vote for candidates who fly that flag, are inclined to do so, at least some of the time.
I think, though, that one of the key pieces, and I think about the Norm Ornstein, Thomas Mann book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, was that when you have a deliberate party strategy that is about demonizing your opponent, and about not governing, but about obstructing, that what happens is that you get this kind of asymmetry that we're seeing. And I'd liken to what we see to that you have one party that believes in the institutions and is trying to govern by the institutions and is basically fighting by the Marquise de Queensberry rules. And you have another that is fighting by the WWE rules, where you get the flying suplexes and the can openers coming out of the boot while the ref is turned away. And so how do you find comedy when you have that kind of imbalance, that kind of asymmetry, where you don't even agree about the basis of elections, where there have been numerous audits and you get this kind of defilement, this kind of lying about the results of an election, which means that you're denying the votes of American citizens. And so when you have this assault on the basis, the legitimacy of American citizens casting their votes, then you're getting this assault not only on the institutions, but on democracy itself. And that's what we really have to reckon with.
I very much agree with this point. I think this is a moment of realpolitik, and that to obscure it with discussions about culture and persuading and the common ground, although those are all ideals that I firmly believe in, and I think most Americans in principle would say they agree with too. We have to look at what actually is occurring here, and that is a effort to deny. There are many Americans who deny the outcome of a national presidential election, firmly seem convinced that our current president was not legitimately elected, and who have raised a number of false charges, which have been thoroughly investigated, about the illegitimacy of a national presidential election, and remain unpersuaded by evidence and fact. And that, ironically, is being used to institutionalize measures that will achieve exactly what those who hold these views claim to fear. That is the disfranchisement of American citizens. I don't see that there's anything more important before us as a country than addressing this effort. And what worries me is that one of our major two parties seems to lack a diversity of opinion, which we, Democrats often unable to govern themselves. There are problems with that and perhaps some virtue in it when you see what it means to have elites within a party not being willing to stand up and find that common ground. That's a very, very worrisome development.
We've talked quite a bit about this difference between the two parties and the impact that's having on the assault on our basic fundamental institutions. I think we have to also bring into the conversation that what is completely unique this time around compared to Reconstruction and post-Civil War is we're living in a media ecosystem that is entirely different. And one of the powerful forces that has enabled these millions of Americans to hold on to an idea that has been proven false time and time again is in fact the ability to select media sources, both traditional and social, which are designed to affirm what they already believe. And I think it seems to me, as a sitting politician, including the President of the United States, how to actually reestablish a factual basis in this media ecosystem, which we have not understood how to regulate, which we have not understood how to mitigate its impact. It seems like for our topic, we really have to talk about that.
Well, certainly, and I think one of the culprits here are the media institutions themselves, which I think have all too quickly sort of acquiesced in the condition that people are going to choose, news reports and opinion pieces that sort of suit their own ideology. I mean, if you go on the New York Times website now, you're bombarded with opinion pieces. It used to be the opinion pieces had their page, their op-ed page and the editorial page, but what you got were mostly very factual news reports that aspired to be objective. That doesn't mean reporters were always perfect about keeping their biases out of the news, but that was the professional ethic, and they set up practices and institutions and methods to make sure that a liberal, a conservative, a leftist, anybody picking up that story, that newspaper, could trust it, could get the facts. They might have some quibbles, but that it would be a reliable account. I think our media institutions are too quick to abandon that model, which they fear is no longer profitable, and to embrace a model of we have a liberal space for news, we have a left-wing space for news, we have a conservative space, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't think it's totally in the hands of journalists and publishers and tech people, but I do think, again, to come back to that idea of a silent majority, there probably is a large market out there for news that is uninflected as best as possible, that tries to include a range of perspectives, without engaging in false equivalence. But I fear that we're moving away from that as the governing framework, which is basically what held in American media for 100 years or so, and that is crumbling. And with it, I mean, that is basically, a cornerstone of liberalism and democracy that we're losing.
Well, I think this is, both of you are making a very important point here, but I'm reminded in listening to you about the fact that we have not only the influence of these new forms of media, which on the one hand, one could celebrate as a democratizing of the political conversation, but unfortunately has tended to further polarization. We also have the conflation of, or the convergence of that moment, it's not an accident, with a former president who rose to capture a political party through his career as a reality television star. That became the platform by which most Americans came to know Donald Trump. And whatever one has to say about the former president, he was a master at using these new forms of media to advance his views and his power. And so you're seeing the conflation of a sort of cultural and technological reality and a specific individual who has been highly successful in using those conditions in ways that have been anti-democratic, in my view.
And I think this is excellent. I think one of the key pieces here is that media, the big media, have been what I call baptized in American exceptionalism. And so they saw Trump. It's like where the guy from CBS says, he may be bad for democracy, but he is great for ratings. And so in that sense that you can continue to ride that horse and it would have no impact on American democracy because Americans are so exceptional that this democracy will just last regardless of how many blows it takes. And that kind of sense of, we've been through rough times before, we'll get through it again. That sense that this thing will always be here and always be that city on the hill without really recognizing the deep, hard work that it takes to sustain and grow this democracy, and without recognizing the responsibility that each has in terms of making this thing work. And so when you're going for clicks, instead of going for really strong, accurate pieces, then what you get is a society that begins to click on the headlines, click, 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 and you don't get the depth of the analysis about what is really happening because it's all about reality TV. And I've got to say, as he was riding that wave into the presidency, we have to remember the way that birtherism was absolutely essential in that political ride. And what the subtext of that was that Barack Obama was illegitimate. He was not an American. They said because he was born in Kenya. And it didn't matter where he was born. The way that citizenship works is it comes through your mother. And his mother was an American citizen. She could have given birth to him on Mars. It would not have made him a Martian. He would have still been an American. But the kind of underlying tectonic plates of racism and the clickbait of that became so powerful, became intoxicating in this kind of the biosphere, information biosphere that the media are operating in and that he tapped into, that Trump tapped into. I mean, we've got to pay attention to that business model that is out there and the way that it does not hold itself accountable for what it has done.
I want to pick up on, if I might just, Carol's point about the claim that you heard a lot on the right of Obama's illegitimacy. And earlier in our conversation, we talked about the claim about Biden's illegitimacy. Now, here's a case where, again, without engaging in false equivalence, because there can be that asymmetry, it's also useful to think about sort of the deep structures and patterns at work. Going back to Bill Clinton, who Bob Dole kind of said, the late Bob Dole said wasn't really a legitimate president for the newly invented reason that he hadn't cleared 50% of the vote. We then had Bush v. Gore, where a lot of people, I think more understandably, but still used that word illegitimate toward Bush because there was reason to think that Gore was the rightful winner of those Florida votes. We had it again with Trump. Many people, including Hillary Clinton, including the great John Lewis, who I'm writing a book about now, called Trump an illegitimate president. So this language comes into our discourse. Sometimes maybe it's used as a slogan or hyperbolically, sometimes to make a political point. But over time, both sides are using it. Again, I don't need to say it's equivalent. There's some of these cases that are quite different from one another. But still, the language starts to seep in and take hold so that we really do then start to say, that's not my president. That president is illegitimate. And it kind of reinforces and expands those divides. Whereas if you look at like the way Al Gore himself accepted reluctantly the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore, it was really a model of statesmanship. And that kind of thing, I think, is now kind of fading from our political culture.
We didn't hear, though, after Bush v. Gore, what's going on right now, which is that we've got to stop those white people from voting who might have voted for one or the other. And what we're hearing now is we got the wrong people voting. There are these illegitimate voters, and certainly The Georgia example, Carol's an expert on this. Her work has shown the racial dimensions of this. And we're seeing the exploitation as well of a moment of great evolution and change in American society. We are a very diverse country, becoming more diverse in some sense all the time demographically. And this obviously creates discomfort. But when that leads to an effort to try to undo our basic constitutional rights, there's every citizen should be alert and engaged in an effort to stop it.
So Ellen, you've provided me the perfect segue for how I think we should spend the rest of our time. We've covered, I think, pretty well the mess we're in, how many people are abusing power to keep us in this mess. And one of our last best hopes is what citizens themselves can and will do. And again, in my role as the founding director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, I cannot tell you how many communities we were in where what people were hungry for was, I see the hypocrisy, I see the lies, I see the systemic racial issues. What can I do about them? So I actually want us to shift our attention in our time together and focus on, if we were now in an audience of ordinary Americans, whether they're from El Paso or New York City or Des Moines, Iowa, or Portland, or wherever, what would be our messages to what do we as individual citizens and what can we collectively do to right the ship?
We have to stay engaged. Part of what this fissuring is designed to do is to make us cynical and believe, oh, the system is broken, there's just nothing I can do, and to create a sense of helplessness. And that is the route to the dissolution. We have to stay engaged. We have to hold folks accountable for the policies, decisions that they are making. And that accountability is not by storming the Capitol, Lord. It is by contacting your representatives. It is by talking with your neighbors about what the issues really are. It is about learning what the issues really are and how we got there so that we are informed in our engagement. And we have to register to vote, and then we must vote. And we must know exactly who we're voting for and what we're voting for if we want to have a real, vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy.
I want to build on that, Carol, because I think you've said it beautifully. I think we saw that kind of really taking ownership of what it means to be a citizen in the 2020 election. What I see happening often now is the processes that have gone on to degrade our democracy or destroy our democracy have really worn people down. So the issue about how do we do exactly what you said, I hope that both David and Ellen, you have some comments to make about how to help people re-energize and believe that it is the foundation of American democracy that we, the people, can in fact make this decision and hold people accountable.
Well, I always think, if I were really knowledgeable about how to change society, I would have become an activist or a politician instead of a historian. But I do think one thing that can make a difference is, in the last 20 years or so, our rhetoric and our attitudes about politics have become so deeply moralized. I mean, last September, there was a fight in the Democratic Party about the sequence in which two different spending bills should go before Congress, which one should go first. And each side treated the other as if they were committing some moral wrong over the sequence of two bills. When we go back 20 years to the 90s and earlier, there was a really refreshing and very productive pragmatism in our politics and in the way we thought about issues. It was not whether it was a left solution or a right solution. We all have our loyalties and our ideologies, but it was about getting it done. And I think if we could all kind of try to, next time we want to post on social media or get upset about something, try to put the moralism in check and think pragmatically, okay, what can be done here? What can I do? That at least would be a step toward dialing down this kind of fevered atmosphere we're in, to mix metaphors a little bit and restore a healthier politics.
Ellen, we're really out of time, but I want to give you literally 30 seconds to comment on what do you want to say to ordinary Americans in terms of how to engage at this time?
Well, I think that on the sort of basic level that most Americans are able to look across divisions when it comes to their next door neighbor, then to go on to Twitter and to dehumanize and engage in very uncivil commentary gets us no place. Who profits from these divisions? Ask yourself that, and then get engaged. It's about winning now. It's about winning these battles. It's about getting people elected to office that hold the values that have kept us together as a country and ensuring that they prevail, that the fundamentals of American democracy will survive this very tumultuous time we're in.
Thank all of you very much. I think the theme out of this last conversation is the powers that be want to keep us divided. And we, the people, have got to hold them accountable and ensure that we re-knit the social fabric and social cohesion of our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.